survivors and holding the traffickers accountable. This experience helped Kathleen see a gap in knowledge concerning evidence-based practices and human trafficking response. She returned to school to pursue her doctorate in social work so that she could help fill this gap. So Kathleen is currently an associate professor in the School of Social Work at her alma mater, the University of Texas at Arlington. Go Mavs. She is researching human trafficking and its impact on survivors and service providers and teaching courses related to interpersonal violence and resiliency. She is also one of the community engaged scholars hired under the RISE, R-I-S-E 100 program, tasked with facilitating relationships and exchanges between the university and the community. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Quick sip of water. All right, so how many of you know about human trafficking? Show of hands. Awesome. That's great. Awesome. All right, I'm going to begin with a quiz. So this quiz is to test your knowledge of myths about human trafficking. So if you have a scrap piece of paper, get it out. And so this is on a scale of 1 to 6. And so you're just going to write down 1 through 12. And then put down the number that you think correlates with each of the 12. And then I'll tell you how to score it here in a few minutes. All right, so I'm going to tell you how to score it now. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to add up all of your numbers. However, you're going to reverse score the questions of a star with them. So on questions 5, 7, and 8, you're going to reverse score. So if you had, say, a 6, you're going to give it a 1. Or if you had, say, a 2, you're going to give it a 5. Or if it was a 4, you would give it a 3. The 5, 7, and 8. And then once you've done that, then you can add up all of your numbers. 2, you would give it a 5. Yeah. A 4, you give it a 3. Now add everything up. And that's your total score. So the higher the score, the more likely you would be to accept myths. The more likely you would be to accept myths about human trafficking. The lower the score, the less likely you would be. So anything above, I would say probably about a 15 would be a high score. What do you think? You got a 12?
You said a high score is bad.
Well, it just kind of checks where you are. So,
So a 29 is bad.
it's not saying that you're bad or good. It's just checking where you are.
13.
Okay.
And there's one I want to see why.
Which one?
One off. Yeah, and I want to understand the reverse number.
So because, so like number 5, human trafficking does not always involve sex or prostitution. So if you said true, so 6, which would actually be the right answer, it would give you a higher score to keep it, right?
I said 6, and then I had to change it
To 1, which would lower your score. So you would want a lower score. You want a lower score. You don't want to keep the 6. You want the 1. Okay. So what question did you want?
10.
Human.
Like what? A county, state, human trafficking always involves the movement or transportation of people across borders. I put mostly true, but it doesn't have to be. You can be human trafficked in your own town. So that was just a little vague for me. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I would have gotten a perfect score.
Well, good point. We'll talk about that. Okay, so that was just a little a little teaser. And I'll tell you where to get more information about myths at the end of the presentation. But, okay, so where are we with human trafficking? So human trafficking, the law for human trafficking was established in 2000 by what we call the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was heavily informed by criminal justice priorities, so it's not really based on human rights at all. And it's the way that we talk about it in the United States now is the 4 Ps. It used to be called the 3 Ps. We included the partnership P. So it's really talking about prevention, protection, prosecution. Those are the original 3 Ps. So it's all about get the trafficker, hold them accountable, protect the victim, rescue them. The 4th P, partnership, is about collaboration across organizations and within the community. This is where religious organizations and triaging between nonprofits and medical providers and law enforcement is really important. Making sure that everybody's on board so that we can provide the best services for survivors. Another really important thing to understand about our current movement around anti-trafficking activities was established in 2005 with that reauthorization. So every once in a while, there's a reauthorization for the TVPA. I think the most recent one was in 2018, around then. Every time they reauthorize it, they put more tools in the toolbox. Sometimes those tools are really awesome. Sometimes they're not so great. This is one of those that wasn't so great, and it had huge impact, still lasts today. And the way that we think about what is and is not sex trafficking, and who gets funding and who doesn't. It was called the Anti-Prostitution Loyalty Act, or Oath. I don't know why I keep calling it an act. It's called the Anti-Prostitution Loyalty Oath. It was established in 2005, and it basically said, it conflated commercial sex and sex trafficking formally. Before, those two things were considered kind of separate. With this, they were interlinked and intertwined. They were synonymous. It was really problematic because until that point, what this oath basically said is that any organization, foreign or domestic, that was seeking funding through the U.S. federal government had to have as part of their mission in their document somewhere a formal statement that said that they would in no way, shape, or form condone any type of prostitution. That was harmful for some organizations that were doing things like street outreach for AIDS, HIV work, for example, and had been for years, right? So you can see how that would be not a good thing. They couldn't necessarily have that and still do the work that they were doing. So it kind of really flipped on its head who was eligible for funding and who wasn't, and who could be considered a survivor and who couldn't. So this was on the books for about 10 years before the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. So that had a long period of history in which it really drove a legacy of, I guess you could say, who was worthy and unworthy, right? So I don't think this conversation is necessarily going to be kind of earth-shattering at this point. I think a lot of people really understand this, smuggling versus trafficking at this point. But I do think it's worth kind of revisiting because trafficking can be really kind of confusing just because it sometimes makes you think about traveling and because of the word traffic, right? So trafficking is really about, kind of harkening back to what you were talking about earlier, trafficking is really about a violation of a person's autonomy, right? So therefore, it's really a human rights violation, right? So it's about force, fraud, or coercion. So in the TVPA, the definition of human trafficking, we have to be able to prove that force, fraud, or coercion existed in the elements of the offense. That's what sets it apart from other types of interpersonal crimes. Without one of those three elements, it's not human trafficking. So in the sense of sex trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion existed in order to compel someone to engage in some type of commercial sex, unless they're under the age of 18, and then we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Minors don't have the right, essentially, to engage, right? In the case of labor trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion was used to compel someone in some type of forced labor, agricultural, domestic, hotel industry, whatever, right? Interestingly, there's not that exception for youth, as it is in sex trafficking. Just doesn't exist in law. Okay, so force, fraud, or coercion exists in human trafficking. Crimes committed against the individual, not the state, not the country. And transportation does not have to be involved, right? So you can be trafficked within your city. Transportation, movement does not need to be a thing in trafficking, right? And smuggling, movement is the thing, right? It's a crime against a nation, against its sovereignty. You're moving someone and moving them across from one border to another without permission. So this is not to say that trafficking and smuggling can't coexist. They often do. But they are two different crimes. One is against a nation, one is against a person. I think it's also really important to understand, going back to that myths conversation, that right now in the United States, we have absolutely no concrete statistics about human trafficking. And the reason for this is because there's a lot of methodological and data kind of problems. So if you think about all like the national data sets that we have, DOJ, CDC, Health and Human Services, all those data sets, they're great. They collected a lot of information, but they're siloed. They don't talk to each other. There's a lot of reasons for that, really good reasons for that. But in order for us to see trends of trafficking over time, we need them to talk to each other and to be able to integrate those data together. And so there's really smart people trying to figure that out right now. But historically, we haven't been able to do that. What we do have are pockets of data regionally that we can kind of stitch together, but there's going to be holes in all of that story, right? So we have estimates, but there's going to be a lot of holes in those estimates. So there's nothing really concrete in the United States. According to the UN, there's about $150 billion that are earned by traffickers worldwide, globally, and high-risk industries are listed here. Most of them involve labor trafficking. So think about, yeah, home health. Yeah.
Okay.
I was trying to think of the word. Yeah,
Okay.
home health.
I was thinking clinics and things.
Yeah, home health mainly. Okay, so types of slavery, I'm thinking globally here. Forgot to advance this one. So slavery through false contracts, chattel slavery, which would be like antebellum slavery we had a long time ago, and then debt bondage slavery and war slavery. That would be worldwide. Types of slavery that exist are state-imposed forced labor that you hear about in other countries. Forced sexual exploitation you hear about here all the time. And then forced labor exploitation. So what do you notice here is that forced labor is actually way more than forced sex. Yet we focus way more on forced sex, right? So when we're thinking about identifying what is trafficking, what's not, we often in the field think about the AMP model, what we call the AMP model. So action, means, and purpose. So the action of obtaining the person, so recruitment, transports, providing, obtaining, and attempts. So how is that person gotten, right? And then through what means, the force, fraud, or coercion. And then for what purpose? For sex or forced labor? If you can kind of check off the AMP, then you might have a trafficking situation. When we're thinking about labor trafficking, we think about it on a continuum. Everything from abusive labor on this side and exploitative to trafficking on that side. So abusive labor is more legal. It's not illegal. It's certainly bad, but it's more about dishonest wages, lack of breaks, maybe a few like OSHA violations, and some lack of wage or lack of labor adherence, like labor law adherence. It's just a really bad work situation, right? But exploitative labor is increasingly less legal, increasingly more abusive, and increasingly more about taking away the person's autonomy. And the more you get to the point at which the person feels like they cannot leave and they do not have their own autonomy, that they cannot leave, their documents are being taken, things like that, the closer you're getting to trafficking. So the thing about labor trafficking is that it's often really hard to identify because it exists often within legal frameworks, within legal work. So it's sometimes protected by law. So like if you're working in a hotel, right, you're being trafficked, you're probably also working alongside people who aren't being trafficked. So the whole situation is legal, right? And you yourself are probably working in a subcontracted labor situation alongside people who are being directly employed by that hotel. And so the whole thing looks legal. So nobody from the outside can really tell, right? Who would what? Yeah, the hotel thinks they're hiring subcontracted labor. But, yeah. Yeah. So maybe like for that 8-hour block, that person's working there, and then they go to another hotel and work for an 8-hour block straight. And so the subcontracted labor company just keeps them working constantly. But, I mean, that's how they do it in agricultural work. So on the surface, the whole thing looks legal. And they are working among people who are not being exploited. So it's hidden. Yeah. And it's not well understood. So, and the other thing is that there's a lot of cultural nuances being used against the people who are being exploited at the same time. And often the same tactics of coercive abuse that are used in sex trafficking are also being used against people in labor trafficking. And could be also sexual abuse being used against them as well.
So another example might be people who are undocumented who are employed, and one of the things that the subcontractor can hold over them is will report you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Or if people, there was I can't remember, I think it was in Michigan. Or South Dakota, don't hold me to the state, but there was a case, in which people with intellectual disabilities were being trafficked in a hotel. They were being, like the hotel keepers or whatever, the housekeepers. But they were being trafficked to clean rooms. But yeah, so people with intellectual disabilities are highly vulnerable to stuff like this too. There's a great book called The Bunkhouse Boys, or Boys in the Bunkhouse, something like that. And the case was actually prosecuted under EEOC, not trafficking, but essentially it was a trafficking case. And so people with intellectual disabilities from Texas were being recruited by a family in Iowa, and they were supposed to be doing like some kind of farm work, but they were kept in deplorable housing. Yeah. It was awful for decades. And promised like retirement, all kinds of stuff, and the families had no idea. But it was, anyway. But that's how that can happen. Okay, so types of sex work. So you take that kind of same kind of thinking and apply it to sex trafficking. So you have on one side non-exploitative sex work, all the way to exploitative sex work. So on one side you have occasional sex work, transactional sex, prostitution, sex trafficking, so more exploitative. On one side, less dangerous, less illegal, less oppressive. So people who are engaging in things like sugaring or camming or things like that, they have more control. They're the ones that are setting up the dates, they're setting up the whole transaction, they're in complete control. All the way on the other side, they're in much increasingly less control over the entire situation. And in trafficking, they have no control.
Sorry, I heard you say sugaring, and then what was the other thing?
Camming. So who knows what sugaring is? Okay. All right, so sugaring is where you have often like a fake relationship with someone. Sometimes it is not sexual at all, but basically it's usually between a younger person and an older person, like a sugar daddy or sugar mama, and they will pay for like tuition or housing or a lifestyle, whatever, for this fake relationship. Sometimes it is very sexual. That's sugaring. And then camming is where you have a camera in your home or your bedroom and people pay to watch you do whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's how you get tuition paid sometimes. So, like, it's important to think about sex trading, sex work, on this continuum. Because when people are trafficked, after they exit the trafficking situation, they often can find themselves on the non-exploitative side, even after they exit, and then find themselves back on the exploitative side, get out of it, and go back on the non-exploitative side. So they often go back and forth. It's not uncommon.
So if you're on the non-exploitative side, you're at risk. You're more at risk for going to exploitative.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't mean you're going to be trafficked.
Right.
Like, it's not 100%, but you are at risk. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of people who are engaged in stripping, for example, which is non-exploitative, considered non-exploitative, who never become trafficked, right? Okay, I don't know what time I have left. 2:30. Well, I think I'm out of time. I think it's 2:30.
2:36, yeah.
Oh, gosh, I'm so sorry. Okay, So I think for you, I'm going to blow through this really fast. I think what's most relevant is this last one here about Texas. So 234,000 people were found to be labor trafficked in Texas. This was a study done by UT-Austin, I think in 2018. So 600 million was earned by labor trafficking exploiters, and about 6.6 billion from sex trafficking. I know I'm way over time, sorry. 8 minutes, okay, I thought it was out of time. Okay, so for here, indicators are gonna be all over the place, because the more we learn about trafficking in general, the more sophisticated, we become. So I think what's important from this slide is that higher indicators of trafficking have to do with mental health, physical health, and prior risk history, not the ones that you probably heard about, confiscation of documents, things like that, lack of speaking English, things like that. Has to do with your mental, like having a lot of anxiety, depression, lots of physical ailments, things like that. Polyvictimization, so this is the layering of victimization and the co-occurrence of victimization. So there's a lot of crossover between things like intimate partner violence and human trafficking. In the context of just, especially with sex trafficking and migrant women, they're experiencing a lot of community violence and economic abuse, as well as IPV, when they're also experiencing sex trafficking. So that's polyvictimization. There's a lot of abuse happening all at the same time. So this is just thinking about human rights and FIFA. This is supposed to have a lot of animation. I don't know why it's not happening, but basically this is talking about the risk factors of human trafficking. So lack of education, being young, and poor economic and educational opportunities, having a lot of adverse childhood experiences, having experiences of poverty, gender, so being a female, being young, intimate partner violence, nationality, migration experience, and race, ethnicity. So where you have high marginalization, oppression experiences, you also have more opportunity for things like trafficking and other types of abusive experiences. Violence. What's that?
I said one of the examples of the intimate partner violence was an older lady. I mean, I'm just kind of curious as to how common that could be.
So I think I put that up there to be more diverse. But yeah, it does happen. It doesn't not happen. So you can't see it because of the animation, but so there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and number 5, 8, and 18 specifically reference human trafficking. So those have to do with gender equality, decent work and economic growth, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. So sorry you can't see it, but what's important, I think, for you and kind of the takeaway is in this collective impact, especially with FIFA coming, and that is to work with your community and making sure that you have a common understanding and a shared vision of how to work together, and sharing data and this collective kind of accountability around this idea of anti-trafficking. and who's gonna be responsible for what, right? And making sure that everybody kind of trusts each other to move forward in whatever the plan is. Constant, consistent, open communication and building trust. So FIFA has a plan, a human rights plan. They do. I'm on it.
Good. They're not always the most ethical organization, let me just say that globally.
Well, they're trying.
All right, good, I'm glad to know, thank you.
They're trying. And then what can you do individually, right? So one is to increase awareness and understanding, which is what you're doing right now, right? So address myths that you hear. So Polaris International has a great myths page on their website, and a little bit of information about each of those. There's like 12. So one of them is that world sporting events, any of them, Super Bowl, FIFA, whatever, inherently increases trafficking to the area. It's actually a myth. So trafficking exists here whether there's a sporting event or not, right? So the issue is not necessarily that we give all this attention and then it goes away. The attention needs to sustain, right? Because it's here whether there's a sporting event or not. And then make sure that you vet new information before you repeat it, right? Because there's a lot of misinformation about trafficking. Purchase with intention, making sure that because you can have a direct impact on anti-trafficking efforts with whatever you purchase. So I'm still spacing on the name about it, but supply chain, if you Google supply chain and anti-trafficking, there's a couple of really great nonprofits that's all they do is teach you about how to do this, but I'm spacing on the name. Okay.
If you like chocolate, Tony Chocolonely. You can get it at World Market, and I think in the grocery stores now. It's a little more expensive, but it is a company out of, I don't know, Europe someplace. We came in Amsterdam. They tried to work with the whole industry to not have the slavery. I mean, it's child slavery, trafficking types of things in the chocolate making industry. They tried to talk to Nestle and say, let's do something about this. Nestle goes, oh yeah, it's not a good thing, but you can't get to that. So they have, even when you go to their website or whatever, it's about the child labor and trafficking and all of that. So there are companies out there, you're right, that are.
Yeah, there's a couple of them that are specifically looking at all kinds of supply chains and disrupting the trafficking within those supply chains. I'm just spacing out on the name. One of them has to do with a leaf. Volunteer your time and skills. So you may not be able to work directly with trafficking survivors, but you still have a lot of things that talents and skills that you can provide to nonprofits and coalitions and whatnot. Advocate and connect the dots. If you are seeing things that check off the AMP model, say something. Call up the local police department or call up the anti-trafficking hotline and say something.
You see more things in airports, in women's restrooms and that, to be aware, to watch for, which helps a bit. We lived in Oklahoma City area a while, and they have huge trafficking there because you've got I-40, I-35, I-40, where you have lots of intersections too. Like here, we'd have 30, 35, a lot of things. Finding the organizations that are creating awareness. And there was a story of a gal who was at American Airlines, a young gal, and they're at an event, and she showed up later in wherever, Oklahoma.
The thing is, you don't have to worry about finding the organization. All you have to worry about is calling the national hotline.
National hotline.
And they'll do it for you.
I notice, I notice it now all the time, but beauticians, they're required to post a hotline, a number about trafficking.
Is that like a Texas law?
Yeah, it is. It's been a law for a long time.
And I asked my beautician, well, because they're also subject to those inspections, the unannounced inspectors, and they look to make sure that poster is there.
Like health